Yeah, I don't know about those introductions. So I am the session after lunch, so you might be feeling a bit tired. I want to acknowledge that. And I'm also talking about gender equality, which can feel a bit tiring that we're still talking about this in some ways. So maybe it's appropriate that it's after lunch. But we say that we want the future church to be gender equal. Now, I acknowledge there's actually a lot of different churches in the room, and so just so I get a sense of where we are at, would you describe the church that you're in as being gender equal? You want to put your hands up? Just see, so you think your leadership is a mixture of genders? Yeah. Unsure? Okay. And how many of you would say, how many of you are part of churches where the senior position has a woman in it? You people? Yeah. So we're in a little bit of a bubble here. So the people coming to this conference, as I suspected, there's quite a lot of churches where this isn't a big issue. And so when we say the church, that's a very broad category because the church is massive. And even if we start just breaking it down, thinking about denominations, there'd be a spectrum. So from my perspective, and you can correct me if I'm wrong because I speak from a particular perspective. So for some denominations, this isn't an issue or isn't much of an issue. And I think the Uniting Church, I don't know if that's true or not, but that's my impression, seems to at least be ahead of the game when it comes to being gender equal. And then there's other denominations where they're still really debating about whether women can be ordained. So I think the Catholic Church, or I think the Lutheran Church in Australia, or the Presbyterian Church. And I actually remember about 5 years ago now going up to the Blue Mountains to be part of this tiny little group that was trying to encourage female pastors and preachers. And there was a Presbyterian minister there, and he was really afraid that there was going to be filming done. And he said, please don't let my name be known, that I'm even here in this room wanting to learn. And I found that so kind of shocking. But it made me remember, we're all on a different journey depending on where we come from. Now, I come from a Baptist context, and I used to think Baptists are in the middle, perfectly. kind of, maybe that's where I just positioned myself in the middle, yeah, we support women, but there's more that we could do. I want to talk a little bit about my story today, partly because I think we speak often out of our experiences and traditions that we're from. And so some of it might resonate with you, and some of it that might not be where you're at. And so there has been a lot of people speaking at you. I also want to give some space to actually hear your experiences and stories and ideas, because I want to try and get a bit practical as well and think through. I think Joel said we weren't thinking about strategies, but I do want to think about strategies. Stories is good and all that, but I am thinking at the place where I want to think strategies. What does it look like to move in this direction? So that's where we're going to try and go. So a little bit about myself. So I grew up in the Anglican Church, which I haven't mentioned where they are on the spectrum. But I grew up mainly in Queensland. So Queensland Anglican's quite high Anglican Church. And then when as a teenager, I moved to churches in Sydney. And so all the ministers were men. It was kind of normal. I didn't really think about it. There was one woman who was a lay preacher who spoke, and actually the lay preachers were the best preachers in this church because they often were teachers and history teachers or English teachers, and so were very powerful communicators. But I didn't really, think much beyond that. When I was 18, I moved to Canberra to study, and I went to what I thought was a non-denominational university church. And it was non-denominational in the sense that there was people coming from different denominations, and up until that point, I'd only really thought about Anglicans and maybe Catholics. I didn't realize there were other denominations, so it was good for me to start to learn that there are other churches. But all the pastors or ministers there were trained at Moore College. And it was there in that particular church, you might maybe know where I'm going, that I began to explicitly hear it being taught from the pulpit that only men could be the leaders in the church and only men could preach to mixed congregations. This is a large church, so they could afford a female minister, but she just spoke to women and ran women's events on the side. But it was also a university church, so it was in this setting where like all these people are training to be leaders in like different industries and businesses, and I remember sitting there feeling like there was this weight on me and feeling really uncomfortable, but not having the words to be able to name it, because I was told this is from the Bible, this is God's word to us, and I had no idea that there was any other perspective even allowed or possible. And I remember talking to a friend and saying, like, I feel really uncomfortable with this, and that they kind of shut me down quickly, like, it's God's word, we've got to just do it. And I'm like, okay, well, I'm not planning on being a pastor, so I don't really need to think any more about this anyway. It's a bit weird, it's strange that you can be a leader in anywhere else, but not in like a home or the church, but okay, that's what God wants. And then a few years later, I moved back to Sydney. I started going to this little Baptist church because my sister invited me. And through a series of events, I ended up studying at a Baptist theological college. And there, at first, it was like really exciting and liberating because I started to meet people who said, no, you could be a woman and be a leader, and that the Bible actually teaches us this. And I was like, wow, who knew? Now, I won't get into the whole debate because I'm assuming you know, like complementarianism, egalitarianism, they're the two big labels we often use, particularly in the evangelical world. If you are interested, I think the key text we often go to is like how we interpret Genesis 1 and 2. I feel like evangelical Christians, we love Genesis 1 and 2. All debates kind of start and end there. So what we think was happening in the beginning, what's the picture of humankind, what's the picture of women and men, what's the relationship, is it we're all equal but have different roles, or are we all equal and we're both called to represent God? So that's often key. The other key person as Christians is Jesus. So we read the Bible through a Christological lens, at least that's what we say. So we're trying to see how Jesus read the scriptures and what does Jesus say about women. So depending again on what you think about Jesus will shape you. And I guess thinking about the future of the church, the last piece when we're thinking about what does the Bible theology say is like, what is the end goal? What is the picture of the church in the end? When there's a new heavens and the earth, is it one where everyone is included, or is there different people included, or are there different roles in the new heavens and earth? So depending on where you think God is leading us, I guess will always shape you as well. That's all I'm going to say about the theology for now. But it was really exciting for me at first to kind of be exposed to different ways of thinking. And I was very fortunate, and I know this is not every person's case, but I was really fortunate that for a few years, I felt like I was kind of protected in a lot of ways, and I was given a lot of opportunities. So I felt like this is a good place to be part of. There's lots of different opportunities. I said yes to everything. Maybe underneath that was a little bit of anxiety. So it felt like this new time where, yes, they were raising up women leaders, and that was the interest and passion. But I also was aware there wasn't many in the Baptist context. So there's a little part of me going like, well, is there a job after all this study? So like a lot of women that I know, I tried to occupy two spaces. So I started working as an associate pastor. I got ordained in 2012. Part-time I was working, and then I was also part-time studying and trying to maybe get a job in the academic. I don't know why I thought there was more secure work there, but at the time I thought I'd try and get into theology as well, and maybe I can cobble together some job. And I've seen a lot of women, a lot of my friends trying to do the same. In 2015, I began writing a thesis, and it came out of preaching. So I'm really passionate about preaching. And occasionally I'd be asked to preach or speak on what does it mean to be a woman and preach. And I didn't know what to say to that question because I don't know what it is to be every woman. I only know what it is to be me. And so I felt this weight that I'm meant to somehow capture all of my gender and say something about how it affects preaching. And I don't know how much, I can't unwrap my gender from the rest of who I am in my own identity. So how much is it gender or just me? And so I always found it really uncomfortable. And it used to happen sometimes in class too. People would be talking about a Bible passage, and they're like, let's get a woman's perspective on this passage. Christine, what do you think? And I'm like, I can give you my perspective, but again, I'm not carrying, I don't want to carry the weight of this is what all women might see in this passage. So I wanted to do some thinking about this, so I decided to start looking into some feminist literature. Now, feminist, that word had been popped around. It was in little reference lists at the bottom of different subjects, but I actually hadn't engaged in any feminist readings of the Bible up until that point. And I also, this is now 8 years into studying in a theological college, I'd never thought about hermeneutics. I'd never thought about interpretation. I just assumed that the way I interpreted, was easy and natural and simple. And so before I had to engage with feminists, I had to spend a few years thinking about how do I read the Bible? How am I understanding it? How do I interpret it? How am I applying it? And why have I never thought about this before? Because I think this is so critical to all the debates and discussions and arguments that then the church goes through. Often comes down to hermeneutics. So as Christians, especially as evangelical Christian, the context I come from, the Bible is the central place that we go to wrestle with, and we have a lot of respect for it. We give it a lot of authority, and a lot of our arguments are often based there. Like I said, with the complementarian egalitarianism, it's all based on how we are reading the Bible. But I hadn't really thought about how complicated that task is and what I bring as a reader into that situation, the traditions that I come from, how they've shaped me, and also what's happening in the text, what is the Bible. So I had to do a huge work of that, and then I started to engage with non-Christian feminists. And they opened my eyes up to a lot of things that were there, but I have been in denial about or hadn't really noticed, even though they're obvious. And I spent a lot of time, particularly in the book of Judges, which I'll try not to speak too much about because I could speak about it for a long time. The book of Judges is a really interesting book because it actually features a lot of women in it, women in maybe a positive light, and women in a negative or destructive light. And so a lot of feminists have gravitated to the book of Judges and written about it. So I spent a lot of time looking at the book of Judges and listening to feminists. And I want to give you one thing that I took away from it. So there's this Dutch secular feminist named Mika Baal, who for some reason in the 1980s got into the book of Judges, and she wrote 2 books on it, and then now she's left. She doesn't really work in biblical studies. But briefly in the 80s, she became really interested in the book of Judges. And she read the Bible very differently to how I was taught. So I was taught, you open it up, and you're trying to find the author's intention, which often means, following the main narrative beats of a story, and then you tell it to someone else. As a preacher, you would tell it. She says, we all like stories. We love stories. We want unity. We want coherence. We want things to make sense. But I'm going to come to the book of Judges and read it differently. I'm going to read it by not looking at the main storyline. Can you do that? But I'm going to look at the margins. I'm going to look at the women. I'm going to start there. And I'm going to look at the the threads that are left hanging, and I'm going to see if I can tell or bring together a new story. So she calls it, because it's very academic, counter-coherence approach. But basically it's about trying to tell an alternate story from the same source. So it's grounded in the text, but just starting at a different angle. Now the story that she ends up telling about the book of Judges, I'm not 100% convinced by where she goes, but there is good stuff there. Now, I don't know how much you know about the book of Judges, but she would say that the main point of the book of Judges is the main storyline is one of military victories. There's a lot of war and conflict and violence, and we celebrate the military heroes. But when she started from the margins, then she made it about the domestic, the victim, women, when she's like, what happens if we amplified their voices and stories? So I started thinking about this first as a preacher, because as I said, I'm really interested in how we tell stories. And one of the things I think we need to wrestle with when we think about gender equality is the Bible. Because even as an egalitarian, even if I think Genesis, gives a good vision of women and men being equal and thriving and in leadership, and even if I think that's where Jesus goes, there's a huge gap, and I can't preach on Genesis 1 and 2 every week as a preacher. I have to be in the rest of the Bible most of the time. And the rest of the Bible, particularly the Old Testament, which I love, but there's not a lot of women in it. And a lot of the times, it is told from a male perspective. So what do I do, even as a female preacher getting up to preach in these texts, if I'm being a good evangelical, following the main storyline, a lot of the time I'm not talking about women then, and I'm preaching from an androcentric point of view. So what can I learn from someone like Mika Baal? And I started to think about, can I, as an evangelical preacher, begin to use counter-coherence as a tool in preaching. So I became very interested in trying to amplify women's voices in the text whenever they appeared. And one way that I did it was through first-person narrative sermons. I also think there's a huge conversation when we talk about the future of the church, whether there's a future in preaching, but also creativity. Where does creativity fit into that? And giving first-person sermons is something that often gets taught in Bible colleges that no one ever uses afterwards because everyone gets, really scared. But if you've ever given it or tried or heard someone tell a story from a perspective of a character in the Bible, people listen. I don't know if you've ever preached, but a lot of times people look bored when you get up and preach. Maybe it's just me. But when you preach in a different way or do something different, everyone's like, I don't know what's going to happen. People listen differently. And there's something about creativity that kind of relaxes people, and telling a story sometimes relaxes people and engages different parts of their brain. So I think that's really powerful. But particularly then, I started to become convinced, okay, part of what shapes a church moving towards being a gender-equal church is, this, as Karen was saying, the stories that we tell and the theology. So where I can start is in what I'm preaching. And that was good for a few years. I started as a senior pastor in end of 2017 at Seaforth. I would say Seaforth is a gender-equal church. But then I started to look a little bit broader at my denomination. So when I first started, I was like really excited and optimistic, and it felt like, yeah, this is the future. People think the future of the church is gender equal, and we're working towards that. But I don't know if my perspective changed or if things changed, but it started to feel like there was a shift in our denomination, and it started to feel less likely that this maybe was the future, or that maybe we shouldn't take this future for granted. And so sometimes I spend too much time on Facebook. And I was on Facebook one day having multiple conversations with people, which maybe you shouldn't do, but I ended up at the same time having 3 conversations with 3 different women. One woman was someone who'd been part of our movement, who'd been ahead of me, who'd kind of been a role model, but she had left. And I was writing to her, and she said one of the reasons why she left was that it felt like a boys' club. The second woman I was talking to was someone I'd studied with at college. We had been ordained to be pastors at the same time, but she had had quite a negative experience working in the church. And so she had left pastoral ministry. And she said, like, she could not step back into a Baptist church. Like, it caused too much trauma. The third person was someone behind me, so someone who had recently just finished her studies, kind of looked like a shining light, like a future leader, but had been involved in a really complicated sexual harassment case. And so she was out of pastoral ministry and potentially out of the church. Now, occasionally I've heard those stories, as I meet different women, but I think just having them all at the same time really hit me. And I felt convicted that I needed to do something, and I also recognized that I was quite fortunate that I hadn't had a lot of these negative experiences, that I was still in the church, and I was, now a leader, at least, 10 years in, that I had a responsibility to do something. And I was finishing up my thesis, so I'm like, I've got time, what next? So I reached out to some of the women I knew, saying, and this is after, just out of COVID, so, we've all adjusted to Zoom. I'm like, let's get together. Who wants to get together on Zoom and talk about solutions? I don't want us to necessarily talk about all our bad experiences, because we could be there for a while. Let's get together and talk about what would it look like for us to be seriously moving towards a gender-equal church. And amazingly, I don't know your experience when you send out emails. I don't always get replies back, particularly from my church members when I'm asking, do you want to do this? Do you want to meet up? I often get nothing back. But when I sent out this email, all these women were like, yes, we want to be part of this conversation. I knew a lot of them had occasionally talked about wanting to do something similar, but, everyone has busy lives. So we got 40 women on Zoom the first time, and we broke into breakout rooms, and we started putting together a list of concrete solutions or strategies we could take to try and shift the culture of our church, wider church. And then we wrote a letter, and we signed our names on it, and we delivered the letter to our denomination's board and the theological college's board. There's something really powerful, I think, about collaboration. I think that's what we're trying to do here today, and something I've been convinced of in the last few years. If we want change, I think collaboration is key, because a lot of these women had approached people in power before, and they're just one voice, and often they get written off like, you're just one voice, one annoying voice that keeps coming back. But when you, I don't know, people seem to take it very seriously when there's lots of names signed to something. They're like, oh, maybe this is more than one voice. So both boards agreed to meet with representatives from our group. So we met with both boards. I know that there are some people in this room who are part of this process and who contributed to this. So feel free to add later. But there was, again, a wide range of opinion and response by the board. So some people on the boards were like, we hear you, yes, we do want to see change. Some of these ideas look like it can work. Other people on the board did not seem that interested. And I realized, and I think this is I don't know what you'd call a philosophical perspective, but there seems to be a debate amongst Christians about whether something is like, do we look at it from an individual perspective or do we look at it from a collective perspective? So I think a lot of Christians, they get moved, if they hear like one person had a bad experience, like at one individual, organizations like, that's so bad, okay, let's help that individual. But when you talk about like wider structural changes that might need to take place, I think some Christians either don't see it or are uncomfortable talking about structure. They'd rather talk about individuals. Or they might say, there's a few bad individuals, but most of us are good individuals. Or there's a few individuals that suffer. One person did tell us that maybe it's part of your faith to suffer as a leader. So I realise there's a difference maybe amongst Christians when we think about change. How much is it up to the individual to change, and how much is it part of the organisation to change? So we met that response with the board. We gathered back and we reported back to our group and we said, they said they're going to take on some of our suggestions, like, what do we do next? And the group felt it was really important, actually, then that we made this public. Because sometimes I think it's hard to create a gender-equal church because in my experience, a lot of women often talk about this, but kind of amongst themselves, and maybe they don't have any power. And sometimes those discussions might happen behind the scenes, but there's not a lot of talk publicly. And so we thought, no, we actually want to make this public. Because as Baptists, and it would work differently in different denominations, but as Baptists, the boards represent us as all the churches. So we were like, we want all the churches to get on board. Wouldn't that be inspiring? They're going to support us. They're going to say, yes, we want to be gender equal. This is exciting. We want to repent of where we've gone wrong. So let's share what we've been doing with the wider church. Now, to do this as Baptists, it's a very long and complicated process because an individual church has to bring a motion to the assembly, and you have to do it like 3 or 4 months beforehand. And for an individual church to bring a motion, that church needs to be in agreement and vote it in, so you've got to take the church on a journey. So we went through this process, and we brought 3 motions to the assembly. So 5 churches went through this, and they brought 3 motions to the assembly. The first was that there'd be research conducted, looking into the experiences of women, particularly women in leadership, and particularly around the issue of sexual harassment, just to get some concrete data. Because sometimes when you talk to people in power and say, I don't think we're gender equal, they'll be like, that's just what you think. It's just your experience. So we're like, okay, it's really important then to get actual data so we can be like, well, it's not just my experience. Actually, if we look wide, it's a common thread. The second motion, which was the most controversial motion, it turns out, and again, maybe it's because Christians approach this differently, was that we wanted to have all our denominations, boards and committees commit to a quota of 30% women on the boards. We had an amazing woman actually who'd done her PhD in governance and structures in the corporate sector, and so she had all this research backing up like how helpful this is in changing culture and systems. And then the third motion, it originally said quota, but softened when we got feedback, was to set a target of 50%, again, to have women on boards and committees. So it comes to the assembly or the church, well, not all the churches gather, those who are interested or who sign up gather. I presented the motions, and then anyone can get up and speak and give their feedback and say, yes, no, why? And there was a lot of no's in the room, particularly around quotas. A lot of people saying, we should just let the Holy Spirit lead us. The Holy Spirit raises up the people who God intends, and who wants to do good governance or policy. Like, obviously, God's Spirit can't be in that, but we should just let the Spirit move. And there was other people saying no for different reasons. There was one woman who voted no, which I think hit a lot of the women listening hard. So again, not all women agree on the same things. Not all women necessarily think gender equal future is the way we should go. So there was a big discussion, and then they voted. The first motion got through, fine, research, that's good. The quota motion got through, but like at 52%, so just scraped through. But it left kind of a really bitter taste, I think, in a lot of people's mouths, because I guess it'd been exposed where we were as a denomination. So I had thought I'd entered a church that was committed to being gender equal, and obviously we weren't there yet, but, this is where we wanted to head. And I realized, actually, when you bring all the churches into it, we're not all on the same page on this issue. And I also realized, I guess, in this whole journey, that there was no official position around women. So the Baptists in New South Wales and ACT started ordaining women in the late 90s. And I think, I wasn't part of that discussion, but I think what helped it was like not having a position. So every local church would decide for themselves. But if you wanted to, you could ordain. But as a movement, we didn't have an official position. And maybe that was helpful for that time. But like 20 or so years later, without having an official position, it meant you could hire different people at, say, the theological college, which is the central college then which shapes the culture and leaders of the future, who had complementarian views, and maybe one day all of the lecturers might have that view, but it doesn't matter because we don't have a position as a denomination. Or, that could be, you could say the same for who's on the in the senior positions or leadership. If there's no official position, then the church can move and sway depending on who's in power. And I think I began to really wrestle with whether that was good or not, or where does that fit in with my Baptist story. So I know it's very Baptist. Hopefully there's some resonance there. But I want to think about, well, what's next? How do we move forward? Because that's kind of the space that I'm in. And so I'd love to get your input. I haven't really moved through my slides. I have, but they haven't moved. So the first thing I want to quickly talk about is theology. We need to invest in theological education. Theological education is in a very tricky space. Like a lot of academia at the moment, it's a very precarious state. I won't get into it too much because I'm assuming I'm not talking to theological educators primarily. But less people are enrolling in theological education, which means there's less jobs available, which means you cut the non-essentials, which often ends up being women. But if we're serious about changing the culture of a church so that it is gender equal, theological colleges are crucial in this because that's where most people go. Our future leaders get trained and developed in these colleges. So having scholarships that support women is really important. And maybe even more important is developing pathways and strategies where you're actually raising women up to be faculty. This is a real issue. I don't know what it's like in other denominations. It's a real issue, I think, in the Baptist denomination at the moment, is that we've had a lot of women do the extra research, often because they're worried about job security, so they become overqualified, and then that can become an issue, like you're too qualified for a job. But it's much harder to see a woman find a permanent faculty position. And partly, and this might also come in with pastoral work as well, partly there is sometimes, which is kind of crazy to think about in our context, like a lack of awareness or knowledge around flexibility and thinking about paternity leave and how that fits in and how do you support women who might want to have families and children as well. Like, that hasn't often entered people's imaginations. I had one friend who was doing her PhD who became pregnant, and there wasn't any leave available for her, but she also happened to work in the theological institution, was kind of able to instate leave so she could take time out and continue her studies, because often women have started and then had to drop out. So theological education is really crucial. to invest in that and to invest in female leaders in that space. But for those of you who aren't working in that space, I think one thing we can all do is read books and resources that are written by women. Again, it was a few years into my study before I started to do this, because it wasn't always on my reading lists, but to be committed to listening to women by buying their products and reading them or listening to podcasts. They are out there. Sometimes people are like, I can't find anything. So that's something you can do. And then to quote them. So if you are a communicator, if you are in your local church, to refer to female theologians that you're reading. One of the critiques of feminism, which I'm sure you've heard of before, is that it often is very white and middle to upper class. And so there's this whole other field. There's womanism coming out, which is by Black American female scholars. And I don't know if Will's talking about this next, but the intersectionality of what does it mean to be Black and a woman, and how do I read the Bible from that perspective? Post-colonial feminism is very academic. I find post-colonialism very academic in general, but again, they're having all these interesting discussions around these questions, and sometimes I feel like there is a gap between the academia space and the local church. And one of the things I'm passionate about is trying to bridge that gap, because a lot of these discussions have been happening for some time over here, or even the feminist space. That's just for feminists. I don't know, people who are interested in that. And then the church doesn't even know that these discussions are happening. So if you can be a bridge between these spaces and share this theology with the church, because I think that begins to shape and change culture. Is there anything else that anyone would want to say about the theology space that we can do or add?
Insert Indigenous theologians into your reading.
Yes.
And females.
Yes.
But just any.
Yes. Yep. Insert Indigenous theologians into your reading as well. Female or anyone at this point would be a good start. Yeah. Okay. Preaching. I won't speak too much about preaching because I've done that a little bit. But similarly, I think there is a discussion to be had about whether preaching is the future of the church. Again, I'm not sure if it's the best model for learning. And again, we do teach this at theological colleges, but then everyone goes into their churches, and I don't know, a lot of churches love preaching. So in my context, preaching is still the predominant form of communicating. I don't think it has to be the only form. But preaching is a powerful opportunity to think and model gender equality. So who are we getting up to preach? How regularly are we having different people preach? There was a website called Fixing Her Eyes, which is trying to list all the places where women preach. And it's a good start. But sometimes it doesn't really say, how often. So, I don't know, church feels good if they're like, yes, once a year on Mother's Day, we have a woman preach. We're gender equal. I mean, that's a good start. But I wanted us to do better. And again, it can be, I think we just keep pressing out on who needs opportunities. So often, it can be hard to get a start at any point, but being willing to bring in new people. So I used to teach preaching, and people had to practice preaching as part of their assignment. And so some people couldn't find placements. I'm like, come to Seaforth and just preach there. We'll welcome you. So that's one way. If we have the opportunity to give the platform, especially I think to people who are coming up. Because I'm so thankful for the people who gave me the opportunity to learn and grow. And as I said, I think preaching has this big opportunity to bring a lot of the theology and shape the culture. Yeah. Anything else anyone would want to say about preaching?
Just perhaps tensioning between preaching and theology. Something that came out in just the chats that you've all kind of seeded in this morning was over lunch was that perhaps when we're doing kind of our preaching and our theology in churches, it's interesting that until you're aware of it, you don't know the resources that you're pointing people to. And so perhaps with both of these, if you like, when there's preaching and theology within our church buildings, then it reflects on when someone kind of is interested in baptism or how do I increase my relationship with the church and what does it mean for this, that we literally have the resources or the list of resources or whatever that include a lot of female voices, diverse voices, Indigenous voices, whatever, but perhaps that side of resourcing the within, not within the colleges though, but within our actual church buildings. I guess.
Both.
Yeah.
Not all the colleges have good reading lists. Some of the reading lists need to be updated and out. Yeah. But yeah, naming. And I tried, if I was preaching, I'd have a beautiful PowerPoint and I'd have like the name and book. And I'd also have a copy of the book if anyone wanted to. Another thing we can do is support. So there's heaps of networks. Maybe, I don't know how useful I find it, but anyway, some people do. There's lots of networks women can connect to, particularly again on Facebook. I feel like every network is available, like Christian women in academia, evangelical women in academia. It could be two different things. Christian women preachers, evangelical women preachers, Baptist women preachers, Baptist women pastors. I'm sure maybe there's one for your denomination as well. There's lots of groups that women personally can get into. And I think I do recognize that some people, particularly I think of a lot of our Anglican sisters, do feel really isolated working in Sydney. And so being, I just kind of look in on the preaching page. Like I do see a lot of them asking for prayer and feeling really nervous when they're getting up to preach. And so it's so lovely that there's like all these women kind of saying, I'm going to pray for you and support you. So that can be really powerful if you are feeling isolated. Hopefully different denominations or churches also have like support networks or pastoral renewal groups that you can be involved in. But I think a massive way we can also support is like giving women opportunities, again, similar to what I said to preaching. So walking with somebody, giving them the opportunity, not just like throwing them into the deep end. And something I've been wrestling with, and it'd be interesting to hear, I guess we have different opinions about this, is like when do you stay in a church and when do you go? I've met a lot of people coming into my community recently who are in the process of leaving, but they've been part of churches for a long time that were complementarian. And I think they had the hope that their presence there would like help change the system. Like, I'm going to bring good, I'm going to change that minister's mind. And after 10 or 20 years, and also they're often there for their children because a lot of the churches sometimes are big and they have a good youth program, and so we'll stay there for our kids. And once our kids are finished, we'll actually leave because we don't actually find this church healthy. Anyway, it's kind of a strange space. And so I think this is an interesting question around support. If we are serious about supporting women, or it's the same thing when we think about LGBTQI plus people, is often we say we're staying in a system or a church because we believe that there's change possible, and maybe there is. But sometimes I think being part of a church which already is trying to enact this stuff, so already has a female leader or a gay minister, and saying we're going to support you by being part of this community, is actually really even more powerful, because often those churches are small and might not, they're on the margins, they might not exist. And so by saying, this is really important, I think, to what it means to be a follower of Jesus. I think this is where God is calling us. So I'm going to invest my time and support in these church communities. Is a challenge I think we need to wrestle with. When we think about gender equality, I think internal work is also really important. A lot of women I know, I think, have internalized a lot of patriarchal ideas, particularly if we've been absorbed in that context. I definitely have. So when I started out as a senior pastor, I was really uncomfortable in the role. and I was really uncomfortable about being the main speaker every week. I'm like, oh, everyone's going to get so bored of me. I'm just used to being that fun associate that comes in. And so I was trying to give my power away. I'm trying to line up lots of men to speak, and I have a lot of men who are very good speakers in our church. And one of them actually challenged me. They're like, you're just starting out here. It's really important that you establish yourself as the leader here, and it's really important that you own that. And I realized I was still really uncomfortable actually being in a senior role. And I hear that often from different women, and maybe men have this as well, but there's often a lot of doubt and insecurity, and maybe it's because there can feel like a lot of pressure and expectation that I have to be amazing. Maybe the impression is, oh, it's only brilliant, abnormal women everyone's done PhDs, or everyone's fantastic communicators. But why can't we just aim to be ordinary? We just want to raise up more ordinary women and men to be leaders. We don't all have to be exceptional. We just want a vision where it's lots of different ordinary people in churches. One day this isn't an issue that we talk about. So we need to help one another doing the internal work and letting go of those insecurities and doubts. And so that might sometimes mean seeing a counselor or a psychologist or a mentor or a supervisor, because sometimes I can hold myself back. Now that's the focus on the individual, which is often where we land. So that's important, but just as important is structure. And this is my passion at the moment. I know it can feel very boring. Governance and structure, I think, is where the real power lies. And I've spent all this time being preaching. I'm going to change people with my stories. But in institutions, it's the policies that are in place or not in place that shape the culture, whether that's locally or at a denominational level. And I think structure is one of the hardest things to change, but actually the area where I think needs the most attention. I feel like there's a lot of theology out there that you can read, and there's a lot of support networks out there, and there's a lot of people, often women, talking about this, but it doesn't always translate into tackling these structural systems. And maybe this is the trickier side, but some structure things might look like, and once again, I think Will said, this event has been sponsored by a secular organization. Do you know who's really ahead when it comes to gender equality? Secular organizations. There's so many resources out there. The Gender Equality Workplace Council, the Gender Equality Council, and they have all these resources tackling structure and policy that I'm the church could just borrow from or learn from. And so it's having clear policies. Maybe it's having a position, do you have a position statement as an organization that you're committed to this? And if so, then what's your goals? How are you measuring it? The Gender Equality Workplace says you analyze, so you look at the problem, then you design solutions, you implement and review, kind of how you bring change. You keep going through this process, but you need to have a posture or policy to begin that this is important, we're committed to this as an organization, and then what are the goals to help achieve that? Particular goals or policies that I think organizations need to look at is policies around sexual harassment and how organizations then deal with complaints or trauma. And again, I don't know, different denominations will work differently, but if there is a process that the person in charge actually has trauma-informed training and is able to deal with complex situations. Another huge area, I think, particularly for the church, at least in my experience, is around paternity and maternity care for women. I think I haven't seen a lot of women be pastors and have small kids. In my experience, women are single, or they come into ministry once their kids are a little bit older. So I don't have a lot of role models. I'm what does it look like to be a woman and to raise a family and be in the church? Is that possible? How do you juggle that? is the opportunities for other churches to support you during that time. I mean, obviously men do it all the time, but it seems to be a lot harder to see women. And so I think that's a big barrier. I think a lot of women step out of pastoral ministry at that point. Pay is a huge issue. So a lot of women, like in a lot of sectors, work part-time. In 2015, we did gather all the women from the Baptist New South Wales ACT world to begin talking about women. And the director at the time was really shocked to discover that a lot of women weren't being paid properly. And a lot of women, weren't being called pastors. They're being called workers or some other name as they're being paid less. So that was a big concern for him, even though, we have all these recommendations of what people should be paid, what was happening on the ground. Wasn't necessarily reflecting that. So I think that's a big challenge to think through policy and structural-wise. Who's getting paid, who wants a full-time position but can't, or who needs more flexibility but can't. So that discussion around flexibility or full-time work. And then I'm getting old now, so I'm starting to think about what happens when you retire, and if you're trying to work in this space, what's your financial how are you going to survive as you get older, and how can we support? And again, who's on the board? So making sure there's a diversity of people on the board. Lastly, sorry I haven't stopped for feedback because I'm almost out of time. Beyond, there's an old book I once read, it was in the early 2000s, that was Embracing Egalitarianism. And there was a bit of fear amongst evangelical Christian women about not wanting to associate with LGBTQI theology, because often it's considered the slippery slope, right? You start letting women in, and then it's everybody else in. And so some women used to argue very strongly, there's a difference. We're biblical, it's in the Bible, you can support women, we're unsure about these other questions. I have shifted my mind on this, and I notice a lot of female leaders shifting their mind on this question. And I think it's because a lot of the things that I'm saying about women, you could say about any marginalised group, right? And I think once you've been in a position, I'm by no means, I don't think I've experienced massive marginalisation. But even if you've experienced a little bit, or even if you experienced that debate of what is the line that women can serve? You can preach, but you can't be a senior pastor. And then you hear that same discussion being used for another group. Oh, we can welcome, but we can't let them preach or serve in worship. You're like, this sounds very familiar. I think when we think about gender equality, it's really important that we don't just look in on ourselves and we see where's the chance for us to support and come alongside other marginalised groups. Because in a lot of ways, I do have a lot of power. So yes, I can work for gender equality in the broader church, but I also feel this responsibility to stand alongside people who maybe are even more marginalised than myself and say, just like I would call men, I would say, men, if you have power, use your power to help women. Well, I have power too, so who can I stand alongside and amplify their voices and do the same things that I would call men to do? I think there's a chance for women to be part of that conversation, and that can be a risky conversation to be part of. I also think beyond, these debates get so tiring in the church, and I have talked a lot about pastors and leaders. Obviously, the world is bigger than who's your pastor at the church. The church could have an opportunity in the future to be involved in these conversations at a bigger level. Obviously, our culture has been. I think there's been some good work done by Christians around in the domestic violence space in recent years. There's been a bit more resources and training in that. But again, that's a question I'd want to be thinking, how do we raise up female leaders and amplify their voices beyond the church? How do we celebrate what they're doing in other workplaces? And how can the church be part of broader conversations that are happening? And can we be contributing in a positive light? And beyond might also mean thinking, I think, and this is where I probably land, once again, the question I'm asking is, when do you stay? Not just in a church, but in a denomination, and when is it time to leave? I'm at the crossroads of potentially leaving a denomination that I've served in for a long time, which has a lot of mixed feelings around it, and for a whole lot of reasons. But God's Spirit is bigger than one little church or one denomination. So when we think about the future church, we go back to that broad picture. And I want to see, like, where's the shoots of grass coming up? Where is their resurrection? And I see signs of new life. I'm excited by this conference. I'm excited by, like, the different forms of friendship and collaboration that's happening. And I want to continue to, like, look into that, to think, God is bigger and broader than my little space. Yes, I'm working in this little space, but also maybe I need to expand my view and see what God is doing. So, thank you for listening to me. I was going to have a lot more interaction, but please give me your feedback or any insights. I'd love to hear what's happening in your space and get some ideas as well. But God bless you.